Have you ever found yourself at the checkout just looking at the total and kind of wondering why everything seems to be just a little bit more expensive lately?
Yeah, that feeling's familiar.
Maybe that new phone you were looking at, or, even your weekly grocery bill just felt surprisingly steep.
Hmm.
What if I told you that these everyday costs, for ordinary Americans could be directly linked to this huge legal and political showdown, one that's like hurtling towards the highest court in the land?
Okay.
A clash that could fundamentally reshape how Washington works, maybe for a generation.
Wow. Okay. So bigger than just my grocery bill then.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into a really fascinating and, yeah, pretty complex constitutional whirlpool.
Sounds like it.
The Supreme Court is about to weigh in on something called President Trump's sweeping Liberation Day tariffs. It's a policy that has already sent pretty big shockwaves through the global economy and, yeah, America's own pocketbooks.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is that this isn't just some technical debate about trade policy or, economics.
Right.
At its core, this raises an incredibly important question for our whole system of governance. It's like, can a president just unilaterally impose tariffs on nearly every trading partner, acting effectively as a kind of national tax collector?
Hmm.
Or does that authority fundamentally and maybe exclusively belong to Congress? The answer's there. They have profound implications, way beyond just economics. It touches the very balance of power in our democracy.
Absolutely. So our mission today is really to cut through the noise on this. We're going to sift through the legal articles, the court rulings, the economic analyses you've pulled together. We'll try to understand the core arguments from both sides, explore the, frankly, immense stakes for the Supreme Court, and maybe most importantly, distill what this all means for your wallet, for American businesses, and yeah, for the future of presidential power versus congressional authority.
Got it.
We're here to help you explore every facet of this complex constitutional clash, hopefully ensuring you're well-informed without feeling, totally overwhelmed by the legal jargon.
Let's do it.
Uh,
The Liberation Day tariffs. President Trump's bold gambit.
Okay, let's jump right into the heart of it then. Let's set the stage with President Trump's bold gambit, which his administration actually dubbed the Liberation Day tariffs.
Right. That name itself tells you something.
It does. Now, to understand the gravity here, you really need to grasp the sheer scale of these things. These weren't just like a few targeted duties on, say, solar panels from one specific country.
Yeah, definitely not surgical strikes.
Not at all. These were announced back in 2025 by President Trump, and their breadth, their scope is what truly sets them apart. It's really an unprecedented assertion of executive economic power.
That's such a crucial point. These tariffs were incredibly sweeping, just vast. We're talking about a really broad swath of imports designed deliberately to impact nearly every single trading partner the U.S. has, from basic raw materials,
Yeah.
Steel, aluminum,
Yeah.
all the way to sophisticated consumer electronics.
Yeah.
Your smartphone, your new TV, pretty much every item crossing our borders was somehow touched by this policy.
Wow.
The administration's intent was, I think, pretty clear. Signal a dramatic shift in global trade relations, exert maximum economic pressure. They were designed to be so pervasive that almost no sector of the economy, and really no American household, would be left unaffected.
And when the White House announced these, they didn't just say, hey, we're putting on some tariffs because we feel like it.
Right.
It came with some pretty specific and honestly quite expensive justifications.
Oh yeah, they had a rationale laid out.
So what were the administration's stated goals for such a massive economic play? I mean, one that would inevitably reshape trillions of dollars in trade.
Well, the administration outlined three primary reasons, and they tried to frame them as much more than just economic tools. First, and this was pretty prominent, they aimed to curb fentanyl flows into the country. So linking trade policy directly to that public health and safety crisis, opioid trafficking.
Right, broadening the justification.
Exactly. Second, they argued these tariffs would address persistent trade imbalances, which the administration viewed as fundamentally harming American industries, American jobs, creating an uneven playing field.
A familiar argument.
A very familiar argument. And finally, the sort of overarching goal, the umbrella justification, was safeguarding national security. They presented these tariffs as a vital tool to protect the country from various foreign threats. But importantly, they were kind of reinterpreting what constitutes a national security risk in the modern era.
So essentially, they were making a strategic move here, kind of reclassifying these persistent social and economic challenges trade deficits, drug flows as immediate national security threats,
Precisely.
which then justifies using powers designed for emergencies. That feels like a pretty profound reinterpretation, doesn't it?
It really is.
But every action, especially one this significant, needs some kind of legal basis, right? What was the specific legal instrument President Trump actually invoked to implement these tariffs, and how was that law originally conceived?
Okay, so the legal hook they used was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA for short. It dates back to 1977.
IEEPA. Okay.
And to understand the court's later objections, it's really vital to grasp IEPA's original intended purpose. Congress designed it to allow the president to block transactions, freeze assets during genuine, acute foreign emergencies.
Like what kind of emergencies?
Think a sudden terrorist attack, sanctions against a hostile foreign power, or maybe a clear and present threat to national security from a specific actor. It was meant for targeted financial actions in times of true, often sudden, crisis.
So quick response stuff?
Exactly. Giving the president flexibility to respond rapidly. It was emphatically not conceived as some general trade policy tool or means to impose broad tariffs across the board. Think of IEPA like giving a city's emergency services a special targeted tool, maybe like a master key, to shut off the gas during a major fire. It's for specific, acute crises.
Right.
The courts, as we'll get into, are basically saying the administration used that master key not for a gas leak, but to try and redesign the entire city's plumbing system just because some pipes were old.
That's a great analogy. That distinction between targeted actions for acute emergencies and broad trade policy seems really crucial here. So how did the president's administration defend their interpretation, their use of IEPA, especially when it felt like such a departure from the original intent?
Well, their defense rested on a few key pillars, mostly advocating for a significantly broad interpretation of IEPA.
Okay.
They viewed the act as granting pretty extensive power to deal with foreign threats that aren't just military but also economic. So this meant issues like trade imbalances, which they argued could undermine the nation's economic stability, our industrial base, or drug trafficking, which they presented as a national security threat because of its impact on public health, border integrity. From their perspective, these were foreign threats requiring presidential action, and IEPA was, the appropriate vehicle.
And did they argue Congress sort of gave them this power?
They did. They contended that Congress, through IEPA and maybe other statutes, had already delegated these emergency trade powers to the president. Their argument was essentially that the legislative branch had, maybe implicitly, maybe explicitly, provided the executive with the necessary flexibility to act in a rapidly changing world. And they stressed the concept of executive prerogative. Arguing national security and foreign relations are core executive powers, and therefore Congress should really defer to the president's judgment in these sensitive areas. They felt that when it comes to the nation's security, its position on the world stage, the executive needs maximum agility.
That makes a certain amount of sense strategically. I mean, you can see the argument for a president needing to act quickly sometimes, right? To protect national interests without getting bogged down in slower legislative processes.
Sure, that's the classic tension.
But the definition of emergency itself seems to be really stretching here. How did the administration reconcile calling these long-standing issues like trade imbalances that have existed for decades, or fentanyl trafficking, which is a terrible crisis but ongoing? How did they call those an emergency?
Yeah, that was a key point of contention. They argued that the nature of emergencies is evolving. It's not always sudden or acute, like an invasion.
Okay.
They posited that phenomena like, say, economic coercion from foreign powers, or persistent cybercrime, or this chronic fentanyl trafficking, while maybe not a single sudden event, still represent extraordinary and ongoing threats that demand rapid, decisive presidential response.
So a slow burn emergency.
Kind of. In their view, waiting for slow legislative processes to debate and pass new trade laws would be like, fiddling while Rome burns. An unacceptable delay when the nation's economic or social fabric is under sustained threat. They also highlighted the need for strategic leverage, arguing these tariffs strengthened the U.S. negotiating position with trading partners, demonstrated resolve to adversaries. It was about projecting power, demanding concessions.
This is where it really gets interesting, isn't it? Where the constitutional and economic implications just slam together. The administration framed these tariffs not just as economic tools, but almost as like weapons of national defense, asserting the president's inherent need for flexibility, decisive action, and what they see as a dangerous world.
Exactly. It was a very strong assertion of presidential power.
Claiming the authority to act swiftly, broadly, when perceived national interests are at stake, and crucially, bypassing what they viewed as, I guess, cumbersome legislative hurdles.
That's the crux of it, bypassing Congress. 2. The lower court's pushback. Why the tariffs were ruled illegal. But, as you might expect, this expansive view of presidential power didn't just go unchallenged.
No, I imagine it not.
In fact, 2 federal courts have already pushed back, and pushed back quite strongly, ruling these tariffs illegal. And that's really what set the stage for this Supreme Court confrontation.
Yes, this is where the judicial branch really stepped in, wasn't it? To assert its role as that check on executive power. So which courts were involved in these rulings, and what exactly was the specific outcome? What did they decide?
Okay, so the legal challenges first landed in the U.S. Court of International Trade, the CIT. That's the court that typically handles disputes over customs, international trade laws.
Makes sense.
And that court found against the administration. But then it went up, and this was followed by a much more significant ruling from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit.
Okay, the appeals court.
Right. And specifically, the Federal Circuit's decision came down on August 29, 2025. It was a decisive 7-4 ruling, so a clear majority.
7-4, yeah.
And this majority explicitly stated, and I'm quoting here, that most of these tariffs exceeded the president's legal authority.
Wow, pretty blunt.
Very blunt. It was a clear, forceful rejection of the administration's claims of broad power under IEEPA, essentially telling the executive, you went too far.
Okay.
And, we connect this to the bigger picture. These rulings reflect a pretty consistent judicial view across 2 courts. They created a significant counter-narrative to the administration's arguments, really emphasizing statutory limits and constitutional principles, signaling that even in perceived emergencies, there are boundaries to presidential action.
So not just one court, but 2, affirming a similar stance on the limits here. That consistency really does highlight the perceived overreach, doesn't it? And signals the seriousness of the constitutional questions.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's delve into the specific reasons then. What were the arguments these courts offered for striking down the tariffs? The first one, and maybe the most fundamental, was about IEEPA's original design, its intended purpose. You touched on this earlier.
Precisely. Both courts strongly emphasized this point. IEEPA was never designed for tariffs, which are fundamentally taxes on imports.
Right.
The core argument was that IEEPA's purpose was narrow, specific, focused on those targeted financial actions, freezing assets, blocking transactions, imposing sanctions on specific entities or nations during genuine, acute foreign emergencies.
Not broad economic policy.
Emphatically not. It was never intended to be some kind of backdoor trade law that a president could just pull out of their pocket to impose broad economy-wide tariffs across the board.
So the courts really contrasted the intent versus the use.
They did. They highlighted the stark contrast between IEEPA's original intent dealing with things like state-sponsored terrorism, actions of hostile foreign powers, specific financial threats, and its actual use by the Trump administration, which effectively became, in their view, a universal multi-trillion-dollar tax program.
Oof.
The CIT specifically found that these tariffs were a broad economic policy tool, not a direct response to an unusual and extraordinary threat, as the statute strictly requires. And the appeals court majority went even further. They said, using IEEPA this way would effectively rewrite the law, basically granting the president unilateral tariff authority that Congress never intended to delegate, undermining the whole legislative process.
That makes it crystal clear. The court saw a fundamental mismatch between the tool, IEEPA, and the job, setting broad trade policy.
Exactly.
And building on that, if IEEPA is explicitly for emergencies, the courts must have had something to say about whether an actual emergency, as defined by the statute, truly existed here, right?
Oh, they certainly did. And this forms the second major argument against the tariffs. The courts decisively rejected Trump's claim that these longstanding issues, persistent trade imbalances, the chronic, though tragic, problem of fentanyl trafficking met that unusual and extraordinary threats standard required by IEEPA.
So they didn't buy the evolving emergency idea.
Not really. They found that these issues, while significant, serious problems, are ongoing and systemic. They're not sudden crises demanding immediate unilateral presidential action. An emergency, in the legal sense of the statute, implies something sudden, unforeseen, requiring rapid action. not a long-term economic condition or a societal challenge.
Yeah.
The judges also pointed out what they saw as the, quote, absurdity of declaring an emergency against almost every U.S. trading partner simultaneously.
Right. If everyone's an emergency, then the very concept of an emergency loses its meaning, doesn't it? It could allow a president to just bypass Congress indefinitely under a continuous state of perceived crisis. It would render the statutory definition of emergency meaningless.
That makes a lot of sense. If a problem's been around for decades, it's hard to suddenly declare it an emergency just to justify sweeping new powers that sidestep Congress.
Precisely.
And that leads us directly to the third argument, which, wow, this goes right to the heart of American constitutional law, power of taxation. This is truly a constitutional bedrock issue. And the courts were absolutely unambiguous here. Tariffs are taxes, period.
Okay.
The U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, unambiguously grants Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Tariffs fall squarely in that category.
The power of the purse.
Exactly. The judicial reasoning here emphasized that allowing presidents to impose universal tariffs under IEEPA would grant the executive branch a power, the framers specifically, and you could say jealously, reserved for the legislative branch.
And that wasn't an accident.
No, not at all. It was a fundamental principle born directly out of the American Revolution, a direct rejection of the British Crown's ability to impose taxes without the consent of the governed. Judges repeatedly invoked that key principle, no taxation without representation, stressing that these tariffs are ultimately paid by Americans, not foreign governments, their costs absorbed by U.S. importers, then passed on to American consumers and businesses.
So the courts are essentially saying the framers specifically reserved this kind of power for Congress precisely because it's so fundamental to how a democracy operates.
Absolutely.
You don't want one person, no matter how well-intentioned they claim to be, unilaterally deciding to tax the entire populace. It's a foundational check and balance.
It really is. And this ties directly into their fourth argument, the major questions doctrine.
Oh, yes, I've heard about this one. Relatively recent, right?
Well, the concept isn't entirely new, but it gained significant prominence in the Supreme Court's 2022 decision in West Virginia v. EPA.
Okay.
The doctrine holds that sweeping policy shifts with major economic consequences require clear and explicit congressional authorization. It's basically designed to prevent executive agencies, and by extension the president, from unilaterally enacting policies that fundamentally alter a significant sector of the economy or society without specific legislative buy-in. Congress has to speak clearly on the big stuff.
And how do the courts apply that here?
They argue that Trump's tariffs, which analysts estimated, remember, would impose that $1,200, $2,800 annual tax hike on the average U.S. household, and restructure trillions in global trade clearly fall under this doctrine.
Seems like a textbook example.
Pretty much. The appeals court viewed such an extraordinary policy as simply being unable to rest on vague statutory language about emergencies. If Congress had truly intended to delegate such immense economy-altering power to the president, they argued, it would have said so explicitly, not buried it within an emergency statute meant for targeted financial sanctions.
That doctrine really acts as a significant check on executive power then, doesn't it? Even if a president claims an emergency, if the economic impact is that enormous and affects so many people, the courts are saying, hold on, you need Congress to explicitly sign off on this. It's about democratic legitimacy for these massive policy changes.
That's the idea behind it, yeah.
Okay, what about the connection, or maybe the lack of connection, between the tariffs themselves and the threats they were supposedly addressing? Fentanyl, trade deficits?
Right. That's the fifth key argument the courts raised. They found a significant lack of nexus, a lack of a real connection or logical relationship between the broad tariffs imposed and the alleged threats the administration cited.
Can you give an example?
Sure. They pointed out, for instance, that tariffs on steel, cars, and electronics from Europe, Asia, and Latin America had no logical relationship to opioid trafficking. It was just very difficult to see how taxing, say, German cars or South Korean TVs would somehow stem the flow of illicit drugs primarily coming from other sources.
Yeah, that link seems tenuous at best.
And similarly, no compelling evidence was presented to show that broad imports of consumer goods genuinely threatened U.S. national security in the specific ways required by IEEPA. They also stated pretty unequivocally that trade deficits are a persistent economic condition, an outcome of complex global markets, not some sudden emergency that warrants such a drastic unilateral response under an emergency statute.
So the mismatch was glaring.
In the court's view, yes. The mismatch between the proclaimed threats and the chosen policy tool was glaringly obvious and legally insufficient.
So not only were they stretching the definition of an emergency and the purpose of the law itself, but the solutions they proposed didn't even logically address the problems they cited.
That was the court's finding.
Okay, that leads us to the sixth argument, which delves more into the specifics of administrative law, kind of the process by which these tariffs were implemented.
Indeed. The sixth argument was about arbitrary and capricious rulemaking, which is a standard concept in administrative law.
Right.
Basically, administrative law requires that government decisions be based on reasoned decision-making. They need to be supported by evidence, follow a clear, defensible process. You can't just make stuff up.
Show your work, essentially.
Exactly. Show your work. And the judges found the tariffs arbitrary in scope and justification, pointing to several deficiencies in how the administration went about it.
Like what?
Well, there was a notable lack of a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis. Nothing that really explained why near-universal tariffs were the least restrictive or the most effective tool for the stated goals. Furthermore, the administrative record lacked sufficient evidence to actually prove that tariffs would reduce fentanyl flows or genuinely enhance national security in a direct, measurable way.
So, weak evidence.
Weak evidence cited in the record. And adding to this, agencies that are normally tasked with trade and economic analysis, think Commerce Department, USTR, were often, according to the court filings, sidelined or their recommendations disregarded, which undermines procedural norms and suggests a lack of thorough interagency deliberation.
So it sounds like the courts were saying the administration failed to show its homework. It was like that chef analogy you used earlier, claiming a dish is gourmet without explaining why they chose those ingredients, or if they even tasted it first.
That's a good way to put it. The judges wanted to see the evidence, the logical process, the cost-benefit analysis behind such a massive policy shift, not just declaration of emergency.
Got it. And finally, the seventh argument circles back to the very foundation of American governance, the separation of powers, a principle just etched into the Constitution.
And this is arguably the most critical concern, because it addresses the potential long-term damage to our entire system of government.
Right, the bigger picture.
Both courts underscored the profound constitutional stakes involved here. They warned that allowing these tariffs to stand would fundamentally make Congress irrelevant in trade and tax policy.
Wow.
It would effectively create a dangerous precedent, allowing future presidents to unilaterally reshape the global economy under potentially perpetual emergency declarations, bypassing the legislative branch entirely whenever they felt like it.
A slippery slope argument.
A very significant slippery slope argument. The CIT issued a stark warning that it would create a precedent where presidents could unilaterally reshape the global economy under a perpetual emergency declaration, effectively turning any long-term challenge into a justification for unchecked executive power.
And the appeals court.
The appeals court majority explicitly stated that this represented executive overreach that fundamentally violated the basic balance of powers envisioned by the framers. It's really about protecting the system itself from an erosion of checks and balances, ensuring that the legislative power to tax and regulate commerce stays where the Constitution put it, with the representatives of the people in Congress. Third, the Supreme Court, a looming constitutional showdown.
So with the lower courts ruling so unequivocally against President Trump's tariffs, the stage is now set for a true constitutional showdown at the Supreme Court. This is where things get incredibly high stakes, doesn't it? With the potential to redefine that balance of power for a generation.
Absolutely. This is the main event, constitutionally speaking.
Let's talk about the landscape of the Supreme Court itself then, starting with its current composition, which is obviously a big factor.
It is indeed a crucial backdrop. The court currently has a 6-3 conservative majority. And importantly, 3 of those conservative justices, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, were appointed by President Trump himself during his first term.
Right, his own appointees.
Which naturally leads many legal analysts, political observers, to believe he might find a, shall we say, sympathetic ear, given the general judicial philosophy often associated with those appointments.
And it's not just the current makeup, is it? There's also a historical tendency, almost a pattern of behavior from the court when it comes to presidential authority, particularly in certain areas.
That's right. There's definitely a historical context. The court has shown, especially in recent years, a tendency sometimes to expand presidential power, or at the very least, to defer to the executive branch in certain areas.
Like what?
Well, we've seen this maybe in decisions like overturning Chevron deference, which used to give federal agencies broad power to interpret ambiguous statutes, or in granting immunity in certain contexts, or generally siding with executive prerogatives in disputes over information or executive orders.
Okay.
And historically, there's also a very deeply rooted precedent of judicial deference to the executive, specifically in foreign affairs and trade matters.
Ah, the foreign affairs angle.
Exactly. The 1936 case, United States v. Curtiss Wright Export Corps, is really a cornerstone here.
Curtiss Wright, right.
This landmark case from the 30s is often seen as the bedrock for expansive presidential power in foreign affairs. It acknowledged the need for the nation to speak with one voice on the global stage and for the president to have, quote, plenary and exclusive power in external relations.
So that history, plus recent rulings.
Right, that historical context combined with some recent rulings suggests a potential tilt toward upholding presidential authority, especially when the issue is framed, as the administration did here, in terms of national security.
Okay, so on one hand, it looks like a potentially sympathetic ear for the administration, given the court's makeup and its past willingness to defer to executive power, particularly in foreign affairs.
That's the argument in favor, yes.
But you mentioned a powerful counterweight earlier, something that could really complicate the picture for Trump, even with a conservative majority. That major questions doctrine again.
That's where the major questions doctrine comes back in, and it's truly the wild card in this whole scenario. This doctrine, which has been particularly embraced by Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Neil Gorsuch.
Two conservatives.
Two conservatives, yes. Yeah. It holds that these sweeping policy shifts with major economic consequences require clear and explicit congressional authorization. It's a principle really designed to ensure that if Congress intends to delegate vast authority to an executive agency or the president to make monumental policy changes, it has to do so unambiguously, not implicitly, not through vague language.
And this was central in that EPA case, right? West Virginia v. EPA.
Exactly. It was absolutely central there. That decision significantly curtailed the Environmental Protection Agency's power to regulate carbon emissions from power plants, with the court arguing that such a sweeping policy couldn't just rest on ambiguous, decades-old statutory language. Congress needed to be clear.
Okay, so applying that doctrine to these tariffs, it seems like a pretty clear fit for sweeping policy shifts with major economic consequences. I mean, the numbers you mentioned earlier are staggering.
Absolutely. We're talking about tariffs that are effectively a multi-trillion-dollar tax program designed to touch nearly every single import into the country.
Right.
And analysts estimate, remember, these could impose a massive $1,200, $2,800 annual tax hike on the average U.S. household. That kind of enormous economic impact, restructuring trillions in global trade, affecting every consumer, it clearly falls under the purview of a major question that demands explicit, not merely implied, authorization from Congress.
So this sets up a really interesting tension.
It really does. It raises this important question for the conservative justices, especially Roberts and Gorsuch. Will they prioritize expanding presidential power, particularly in this realm of foreign affairs where historical deference is traditionally strong? Or will they uphold the principle central to the major questions doctrine, that such sweeping policy changes demand clear congressional authorization, thereby safeguarding legislative power? That tension between two arguably conservative judicial philosophies, executive deference versus limiting the power of unelected actors based on vague laws, could be absolutely pivotal.
It certainly sets up a fascinating internal conflict for the conservative wing of the court. Now, switching gears slightly, what's the likely path this case will take through the Supreme Court? How quickly could we see this actually play out?
Well, given its immense national significance, the profound constitutional questions at stake, the court accepting the case for review seems almost certain.
They pretty much have to take it.
It feels like they have to, yeah. This isn't the kind of case they typically shy away from. Once accepted, the usual timeline would suggest oral arguments occurring maybe late 2025 or early 2026, with a final decision expected by June 2026, which is typically when they wrap up their term. However,
there's always a however.
There is. The Trump administration has already vowed an expedited filing. They're pushing hard for a quicker resolution. That could potentially accelerate the whole process and push arguments into, say, winter 2025.
Which would be good for the administration.
It would certainly be a boon to them, yeah.
Yeah.
Eager to solidify their policy.
So even before we get a final decision on the merits, there's a crucial procedural move the court could make that would have immediate real-world implications, effectively granting the administration a win even before a full ruling.
A stay, right.
Yes. Stay. This is a really significant point. The court could decide to extend the stay that's currently in place, essentially allowing the tariffs to remain in effect during the entire litigation process.
Which could be how long?
Potentially another year or more, depending on the briefing and argument schedule. And this would be a huge practical win for Trump, even before a ruling on the merits.
Why? Because it would keep his policy in force. It would continue generating that revenue, maintain the economic pressure he seeks to exert on trading partners. It achieves the policy goal, at least temporarily.
Got it.
And it's also just important for listeners to remember, while the lower courts ruled pretty decisively against the tariffs, the Supreme Court can, and frequently does, overturn argued cases.
They're not bound by the lower courts.
Not at all. A recent high-profile example was Biden v. Nebraska in 2023. The justices struck down President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan despite broad lower court backing for it initially. The highest court always has the final say, and their interpretation of the law, IEEPA in this case, could differ significantly from the lower benches. So while the lower court rulings are a strong indicator, they are definitely not determinative.
Okay, so looking at all these factors, the court's composition, the history of deference, the wildcard of the major questions doctrine, the potential for a stay, what's the projected outcome, what are the experts saying, what are the current odds, if you could even put odds on it?
Well, hedging is always wise with the Supreme Court. But the most probable outcome, according to a pretty strong expert consensus right now, is actually a 6-3 Supreme Court decision in Trump's favor.
Really?
Yeah.
Even after the lower courts?
Even after the lower courts. This projection heavily weighs that solid 6-3 conservative majority, combined with that traditional historical deference given to presidential power in foreign affairs and national security matters. Remember Curtis Wright. That precedent has deep roots.
Okay.
The current expert and, social media legal chatter consensus puts Trump's odds of prevailing somewhere around 70%.
70%, that's high.
It is high. However, that major questions doctrine remains a very real wild card. If Chief Justice Roberts or Justice Gorsuch, who are known proponents of that doctrine, were to break ranks here and prioritize congressional authority over executive power in this specific context, then what? Then the ruling could tighten significantly, maybe to 5-4. And in a less likely but still plausible scenario, if maybe another conservative justice were somehow persuaded to join them, it could even tilt the outcome against Trump. Though that remains, I'd say, a long shot given the current dynamics.
So the tension is real.
The tension between those judicial philosophies, deference versus clear congressional authorization, is absolutely what makes this case so fascinating and, despite the apparent majority, still somewhat unpredictable.
4. The nipple effect. Economic and political fallout.
Okay, so let's game this out a bit. Let's consider the Whipple effect. If these tariffs are upheld by the Supreme Court, or even if a prolonged delay just keeps them in effect for another year or so, what are the projected economic impacts on the nation, but maybe more importantly on you, the listener?
Right, the real-world consequences. Well, the economic fallout is projected to be quite mixed and potentially pretty severe for many sectors and households.
Mixed how? Well, in the short term, the tariffs might generate a significant amount of revenue for the government, collecting duties at the border. It's estimated it could potentially add around, say, 0.57% to GDP, mostly from those collected duties.
Okay, some upside for the Treasury.
Some upside for the Treasury. However, this potential revenue gain is largely overshadowed by projections that overall economic growth could actually decline by about 0.5% annually through 2026.
Why the decline?
Because the negative effects, things like higher costs for businesses and consumers, reduced trade volumes, increased uncertainty, tend to outweigh those immediate revenue benefits in the broader economy.
Okay. And what about for regular people, the direct impact?
That's where it hits home. The direct impact for you, the listener, is on household costs. Families are projected to face an average of somewhere between $1,200 to $2,800 in added expenses annually.
Wow. $1,200 to almost $3,000?
Yeah. This is essentially a hidden tax on every family. It increases the cost of almost everything: groceries, clothing, electronics, home goods, cars. It's a significant erosion of purchasing power, especially for families already feeling squeezed.
Okay, let's unpack this, because these aren't just abstract numbers, right, or percentages on a chart. These are real impacts on American jobs, on family budgets. It's basically a hidden tax hitting everyone. How does this kind of broad tariff policy affect employment across different sectors of the U.S. economy?
Yeah, the employment impacts could be quite stark. We're looking at potential sharp downturns and job losses across several key sectors.
Such as?
For instance, the construction industry. It relies heavily on imported materials like steel, lumber, machinery. It could see employment shrink by as much as 2.9% as projects just become more expensive, less feasible.
Okay, construction takes a hit. Who else?
Agriculture would also likely be hit hard. Farmers often face increased costs for imported equipment, fertilizers, and maybe more importantly, they are frequently the prime targets of retaliatory tariffs from other countries on their exports. Soybeans, corn, pork, that severely impacts their bottom line.
Right, the retaliation factor.
Exactly. And even manufacturing, despite the stated goal often being to protect manufacturing, would likely face significant pressures. Sharp downturns due to increased costs for imported components they need to make their own products, plus disrupted trade flows.
And the global picture.
Well, global trade disruptions are a major concern. If the U.S. imposes these sweeping tariffs, it's highly probable, almost certain, that major trading partners, the EU, China, Canada, Mexico, others, would respond with retaliatory tariffs on U.S. exports.
Tit for tat.
Exactly. This could slash American exports, leading to renewed disruption in already sensitive global supply chains, increasing uncertainty for businesses everywhere, and potentially triggering wider trade wars that further depress global economic activity. The whole system just becomes less efficient, more costly for everyone involved.
And the squeeze on American manufacturers themselves sounds particularly painful. You mentioned imported components. They seem caught between a rock and a hard place, trying to source materials and stay competitive.
Absolutely. Many manufacturers in the U.S., maybe more than people realize, rely heavily on imported components to produce their finished goods right here.
Like the auto industry.
The auto industry is a classic example. They import thousands of parts, semiconductors, specialized brake pads, wiring harnesses, the things that often aren't produced domestically in sufficient quantities or at competitive prices. Or think about the electronics sector. Laptops, smartphones, medical devices, they depend on these incredibly intricate global supply chains for everything from circuit boards to specialized displays.
So even made in USA might depend on foreign parts.
Often does. Even firms that assemble products here in the U.S. can't escape, cause spikes on those imported components. And for foundational industries like machinery and construction, tariffs on steel, aluminum, specialized tools, they significantly raise the cost of building infrastructure, undermining both private development projects and public investment.
So what's the choice for these companies?
They face a really cruel choice. Either absorb the increased costs themselves, which cuts into their already often thin profit margins, maybe leading to hiring freezes or layoffs. Or they pass those costs along to consumers in the form of higher prices. But then they risk losing sales and market share to foreign competitors who aren't burdened by the same tariffs. Either way, American competitiveness erodes. It makes U.S. firms less agile, less profitable, less able to expand, or even just maintain their current workforce. It's this complex web of interconnected costs that ultimately impacts the strength of American industry.
So beyond the purely economic numbers, the dollars and cents, there are massive political stakes here too, especially with the 2026 midterms looming just over the horizon. How could these tariffs affect President Trump's approval ratings and the broader political landscape for his party?
Oh, the political implications are indeed profound, and they could very well be a political Achilles heel for the administration and its party. Rising costs, directly tied to tariffs, could significantly erode President Trump's approval rating, especially among voters already struggling with inflation or feeling economically insecure.
Is there polling on this already?
There is. Polls already show considerable discontent. Pew Research back in August 2025 found 61% of Americans disapproved of the tariffs, with only 38% approving.
61% disapprove.
Right. Gallup and the Consumer Technology Association did a survey around August 2025. It revealed that 56% of Americans believe tariffs harm the economy, and a striking 65% feared for their family finances due to these policies.
That's a big number worrying about their own finances.
Huge. And Navigator Research back in May 2025 showed 56% opposed tariffs, which was a significant 15-point increase in opposition since Trump's inauguration. What's particularly worrying for the administration politically is that even among Trump's core voters, nearly half expressed worry about rising prices. It indicates this issue really transcends traditional partisan divides. It hits where it truly hurts the household budget.
That's a significant amount of unease, even within his own base. So how might this play out in the actual 2026 midterms, given these economic pressures and this voter sentiment?
Well, midterm dynamics typically favor the party out of power, as you know. And historically, presidents lose an average of about 28 House seats in their first midterms.
28 seats is a lot.
It is. And given Trump's potentially razor-thin majorities, his party would be particularly vulnerable. Now, while some GOP-led gerrymanders in states like Texas, Florida, Ohio might provide some buffer in certain districts.
Yeah, map drawing helps.
It helps, but no amount of cartographic engineering can fully insulate incumbents from widespread voter fury if household costs are soaring because of these tariffs. Price hikes aren't niche political issues. They are Main Street issues, felt in every district, by every demographic, every single week. Anger over grocery bills, utility costs, the price of everyday goods that can quickly translate into significant electoral consequences.
Yeah.
Quinnipiac data, for instance, finds Americans believe 3-to-1 that tariffs raise consumer prices. And critically, even 1/3 of Trump supporters told Quinnipiac they would reconsider their stance if inflation worsens because of this.
Wow, even 1/3 of his own supporters.
Right. This makes the economic impact of the tariffs a potential political time bomb that could detonate precisely when his party needs to hold on to power in Congress.
That's a powerful point. What about the Senate? Is it more insulated from this kind of voter sentiment, statewide elections, longer terms?
You'd think maybe, but even the Senate, often seen as more insulated, could be significantly impacted here. Think about key swing states. Farmers in the Midwest, a crucial voting bloc for the Republican Party. They'd face higher equipment costs and potentially debilitating retaliatory tariffs on their agricultural exports. That's a double whammy.
Yeah.
Manufacturers in critical swing states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, they'd confront increased costs for their inputs, potential layoffs as demand shrinks or supply chains become unworkable due to tariffs and counter-tariffs. All of this directly undermines the GOP's standing in precisely the battlegrounds that tend to decide Senate control.
So seats that looked safe might not be.
Exactly. A chamber that might have looked relatively safe could suddenly be very much in play. And it really raises this important question. Could what was conceived by the administration as an economic weapon against foreign rivals, could it become a political boomerang that flips both the House and the Senate, leading to a truly transformative midterm election?
That's a truly compelling and potentially dire question for the administration. But there's one more scenario we should consider, kind of a curveball. What if the Supreme Court doesn't just rule one way or the other quickly, but instead simply delays a decision, kicks the can down the road? What kind of impact would that have, particularly given the political timeline?
The delay scenario. That would be a fascinating, yet potentially deeply damaging development for the administration's party, politically speaking.
How so?
Well, if the court were to delay a decision, maybe they punt the case to the next term, maybe they ask for re-argument, and in doing so, they extend the stay that allows the tariffs to remain in force for another year.
Okay.
It would effectively be a gift to Trump in purely legal terms.
Yeah.
His policy would continue. He could claim a procedural victory. The pressure stays on. However, for his party politically, it could be an absolute poison pill.
A poison pill, why?
Because every single month of delay means another month of higher costs for consumers, another month of mounting voter resentment, another month of continued economic drag on businesses and families. By the time the 2026 midterms actually arrive, the damage from these tariffs, the increased prices, the job insecurity, the trade friction would be thoroughly baked in to the economic reality faced by American families all across the country.
So the pain is already felt, regardless of the eventual ruling.
Exactly. This prolonged pain could fuel significant electoral shifts. It would make it much easier for Democrats to seize the narrative with a clear, simple message like, we will bring prices down by restoring sanity to trade and ending these harmful tariffs.
A potent message.
Very potent. This could potentially lead to that blue Congress scenario, where Democrats gain control of both the House and the Senate, fundamentally altering the legislative landscape for the latter half of the presidential term and setting the stage for all sorts of future policy battles. It's a really interesting scenario where a tactical legal win, keeping the tariffs in place via delay, could translate directly into a strategic political disaster down the road. Outro. Ultimately, this case is about so much more than just trade policy or, economic figures on a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
We connect this back to the bigger picture. Its outcome will really determine whether presidents can wield this kind of near-plenary power over the global economy, over the domestic tax structure, just by invoking emergency authority.
Right.
Or whether Congress must reclaim its constitutional role in setting tariffs, in regulating commerce. It's just a fundamental question about how power is distributed, how it's exercised in our democracy, and whether the checks and balances the framers designed can actually withstand a really determined executive.
This is where the constitutional and societal implications truly hit home, isn't it? The Supreme Court's decision, or even, as you said, a prolonged delay, it's going to have profound consequences, not just for our household budgets or global markets, but for the fundamental balance of power in Washington for maybe a generation.
It really could.
It's a critical test, a test of whether Congress's constitutional authority can withstand a determined president who's seeking to expand executive power. And it asks, how much authority should one person ultimately wield in a democracy that was specifically designed to prevent kingship, to prevent unchecked power?
Deep question.
They really are. So as you go about your day, maybe checking prices at the store or thinking about the upcoming elections, the choices before you, maybe consider this. How much executive power is too much power, even when it's done in the face of what a president declares an emergency? And what does your answer to that mean for the system of checks and balances that we all rely on? The system designed to protect our freedoms and, our economic well-being. It's a question that, one way or another, is going to shape our nation for years to come.